Hey there. How's everybody doing today? So let's jump right in here and try and avoid the conversation about a certain convention happening right now, because that is precisely what he wants us to be thinking about and talking about and giving him ratings, because that's apparently the most important thing, right? I don't know. I gotta say, out of all the speakers, you would think that he'd just take a cue from, I don't know, anybody that's got to be advising him to keep his freaking mouth shut. But hey, every night, cool. Dig your own grave. You have fun with that. So anyway, part 4, the worst investment ever made. Chapter 13, the political is personal. Nearly a decade would pass before I saw my family again. In October 2009, at my cousin Ivanka's wedding to Jared Kushner. I had no idea why I'd received the invitation, which was printed on the same heavy-gauge stationery favored by the Trump organization. As the limo I'd taken from my house on Long Island approached the clubhouse at Donald's Golf Club at Bedminster, New Jersey, which looked eerily like the house, I was unsure what to expect. Ushers handed out black shawls, which made me feel a little less exposed as I wrapped one of my shoulders. The outdoor ceremony took place beneath a large white tent. Gilt chairs were lined up in rows on either side of a gilt-trimmed runway carpet. Their traditional Jewish chuppah, covered in white roses, was about the size of my house. Donald stood awkwardly in his yarmulke. Before the vows, Jared's father, Charles, who'd been released from prison 3 years earlier, rose to tell us that when Jared had first introduced him to Ivanka, he had thought she would never be good enough to join his family. It was only after she committed to converting to Judaism and working hard to make it happen that he had begun to think she might be worthy of them after all. Considering that Charles had been convicted of hiring a prostitute to seduce his brother-in-law, taping their illicit encounter, and then sending the recording to his sister at his nephew's engagement party, I found his condescension a bit out of line. Understatement! After the ceremony, my brother, my sister-in-law, and I entered the clubhouse. As I walked down the hallway, I saw my Uncle Rob. My last exchange with him had been when he'd hung up on me in 1999 after I told him that Fritz and I were hiring a lawyer to contest my grandfather's will. As I approached him now, he surprised me by breaking into a smile. He put his hand out, then leaned down. He was much taller than I was, even in my heels, shook my hand, and kissed me on the cheek. The typical Trump greeting. "Honey Bunch, how are you?" he said brightly. Before I could answer, he said, "You know, I've been thinking that the statute of limitations on family estrangements has passed," then bounced on the balls of his feet. He smacked a closed fist into his open palm in a not quite accurate imitation of my grandfather. "That sounds good to me," I said. We spent a couple of minutes exchanging pleasantries. When we were done, I walked up the stairs to the cocktail reception, where I spotted Donald speaking to somebody I recognized, a mayor or a governor, although I can't recall who it is. "Hi, Donald," I said as I walked toward them. "Mary, you look great." He shook my hand and kissed my cheek, as Rob had. "It's good to see you." "It's good to see you, too." It was a relief to discover that things between us were pleasant and civil. Having established that, I gave way to the next person in the lengthening line of people, some of them waiting to congratulate the father of the bride. But The Apprentice had just concluded its 8th season, so it's just as likely that many of them were simply there for the photo op. "Have fun," he called after me as I walked away. The reception was being held in an enormous ballroom quite a distance from the Hors d'Oeuvre. Along the way, I saw my Aunt Liz in the distance, chasing after her husband. I caught her eye and waved. She waved back and said, "Hi, sweetie pie." But she didn't stop, and that was the last I saw of her. I walked past voluminous bunting and the highly polished dance floor and finally found my place at the second cousin's table on the periphery of the ballroom. In the distance, I could hear the occasional thwap of rotors as helicopters landed and took off. After the first course had been served, I decided to find Maryanne. As I wound my way through the tables, Donald took to the stage to give his toast. If I hadn't known who he was talking about, I would have thought he was toasting his secretary's daughter. I spotted Maryanne and paused. Fritz and I would not have been invited to Ivanka's wedding without Maryanne's approval. She didn't see me until I was standing right in front of her. "Hi, Aunt Maryanne." It took her a few seconds to realize who I was. "Mary." She didn't smile. "How are you?" she asked, her expression rigid. "Everything's great. My daughter just turned 8 and I didn't know you had a daughter." Of course you didn't know I had a daughter, or that I was raising her with a woman I'd married after my grandfather's funeral and then divorced, or that I had recently received my doctorate in clinical psychology. But she acted as if her lack of such knowledge was an insult to her. The rest of our brief conversation was equally tense. She mentioned that Ivana had missed Ivanka's wedding shower, but said, sotto voce, that she couldn't discuss why. I retreated to my table, and when I realized the vegetarian meal I'd ordered had not arrived, I ordered a martini in its stead. The olives would suffice. Sometime later, I saw Maryanne, looking determined, head toward us as if on a mission. She walked straight up to my brother and said, "We need to talk about the elephant in the room." Then, gesturing to include me, the 3 of us. A few weeks after Ivanka and Jared's wedding, Fritz and I met with Maryanne and Robert at her apartment on the Upper East Side. It wasn't clear to me why Rob was there, but I thought perhaps he planned to make good on his claim that the statute of limitations on family estrangements had passed. I took it as a good sign, but as the afternoon wore on, I became less sure. We didn't discuss anything that seemed pertinent as we sat in the living room with the spectacular view of Central Park and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Maryanne made passing references to the debacle, as she called the lawsuit, but nobody else seemed eager to go down that road. Rob leaned forward in his chair, and I hoped finally we were going to start dealing with the so-called elephant in the room. Instead, he told a story. 10 years earlier, Rob had still been working for Donald at Atlantic City when Donald's financial situation was dire. His investors were getting hammered, the banks were after him, and his personal life was in shambles. When things were at their worst, Donald had called Rob with a request. "Listen, Rob, I don't know how this is all going to end," he had said, "but it's tough, and I might drop dead of a heart attack. If anything happens to me, I want you to make sure Marla will be okay." "Sure, Donald, just tell me what you want me to do." "Get her $10 million. I thought, holy shit, that's a lot of money. At the same moment that Rob said, "What a cheap bastard." Rob laughed at the memory as I sat there stunned, wondering how much money these people had. Last I'd heard, $10 million would have been 1/3 of my grandfather's entire estate. Around the same time, Donald called me to tell me that one of his 3 favorite... Apologies. Let me kick that one back off. Around the same time, Donald called to tell me I was one of his 3 favorite people, Maryanne said. Apparently he forgot he had 3 children. Tiffany and Baron were still to come. He never met with Rob again, but Fritz and I, separately together, had lunch occasionally with Maryanne. For the first time in my life, I got to know my aunt. Not since I'd spent time with Donald. While I was writing his book, had I felt a little bit as though I were part of the family. A couple of months after my aunt's April 2017 birthday party, I was in my living room lacing up my sneakers when the front doorbell rang. I don't know why I answered it. I almost never did. 75% of the time it was a Jehovah's Witness or Mormon missionaries. The rest of the time it was somebody wanting me to sign a petition. When I opened the door, the only thing that registered was that the woman standing there with her shock of curly blonde hair and dark-rimmed glasses was someone I didn't know. Her khakis, button-down shirt, and messenger bag placed her out of Rockville Center. "Hi, my name is Suzanne Craig. I'm a reporter for the New York Times." Journalists had stopped contacting me a long time before, with the exception of David Korn from Mother Jones and somebody from Frontline. The only other person to leave a message before the election had been from Inside Edition. Nothing I had to say about my uncle would have mattered before November 2016. Why would anyone want to hear from me now? The futility of it annoyed me, so I said, "It is so not cool that you're showing up at my house." "I understand. I'm sorry. But we're working on a very important story that your family's finances, and we think you could really help us. I can't talk to you. At least take my card. If you change your mind, you can call me anytime. I don't talk to reporters," I said. I took her card anyway. A few weeks later, I fractured the fifth metatarsal of my left foot. I mean, for God's sakes, I don't care. There's just too much detail here. For the next 4 months, I was a prisoner in my own home, my foot elevated at all times as I sat on the couch. I received a letter from Suzanne Craig reiterating her belief that I had documents that could help rewrite the history of the President of the United States, as she put it. I ignored the letter, but she persisted. After a month of sitting on the couch, scrolling through Twitter with the news constantly on in the background, I watched in real time as Donald shredded norms, endangered alliances, and trode upon the vulnerable. The only thing about it that surprised me was the increasing number of people willing to enable him. I mean, but why? Why would you be surprised about that? He spent his entire... Deep breath, Jess. Deep breath. Gonna keep going. As I watched our democracy disintegrate and people's lives unraveling because of my uncle's policies, I kept thinking about Suzanne Craig's letter. I found her business card and called her. I told her that I wanted to help, but I no longer had any documents relating to our lawsuit years before. Jack Bronowski's might still have them, she said. 10 days later, I was on my way to his office. The headquarters of Farrell Fritz was located in one of 2 oblong buildings sheathed in blue glass. Bitterly cold air pushed between them across the wide open space of the enormous parking lot. It's impossible to park anywhere near the entrance, so after I found a spot, it took me 10 minutes to get to the lobby on my crutches. I negotiated the escalator and the marble floors very carefully. By the time I arrived at my destination, I was tired and overheated. 30 banker's boxes lined 2 walls and filled a bookshelf. The room's only other contents were a desk and a chair. Jack's secretary had kindly put out a pad of paper, a pen, and some paper clips. I dropped my bags, leaned my crutches against the wall, and half fell into the desk chair. None of the boxes were labeled. I had no idea where to start. It took me about a half hour to familiarize myself with the contents of the boxes and compile a list, which required wheeling around the room on my chair and lifting boxes onto the desk while standing on one leg. When Jack stopped by, I was flushed and soaking wet. He reminded me that I couldn't take any documents out of the room. They belong to your brother, too, and I need his permission. Which wasn't at all true. When he turned to leave, I called after him. "Jack, wait a second. Can you remind me why we decided to settle the lawsuit?" "Well, you were getting concerned about the cost, and as you know, we don't take cases on contingency. Although we knew they were lying to us, it was he said, she said. Besides, your grandfather's estate was only worth $30 million. It was almost word for word what he'd told me when I last saw him 20 years earlier." Okay, thanks." I was holding in my hands documents that proved the estate had actually been worth close to $1 billion when he died. I just didn't know it yet. After I was sure he was gone, I grabbed copies of my grandfather's will, floppy disks with all of the depositions from the lawsuit, and some of my grandfather's bank records, all of which I was legally entitled to as part of the lawsuit, and stuffed them into my bag. Sue came by my house the next day to pick up the documents and drop off a burner phone so we could communicate more securely going forward. We weren't taking any chances. On my 3rd trip to Farrell Fritz, I methodically went through every box and discovered that there were 2 copies of everything. I mentioned the fact to Jack's secretary and suggested that it obviated the need to get my brother's permission, which was a relief since I didn't want to involve him. I would leave a set of documents for him in the unlikely event he ever wanted one. I was just beginning to look for the list of materials the Times wanted when I got a message from Jack. I could take whatever I wanted as long as I left a copy. I hadn't been prepared for that. In fact, I had plans to meet Sue and her colleagues, Russ Brutner and David Barstow, the other 2 journalists working on the story, at my house at 1, with whatever I'd managed to smuggle out. I texted Sue with the news that I'd be late. At 3, I drove to the loading dock beneath the building, and 19 boxes were loaded into the back of the borrowed truck I was driving since I couldn't work the clutch in my own car. It was just beginning to get dark when I pulled into my driveway. The 3 reporters were waiting for me in David's white SUV, which sported a pair of reindeer antlers and a huge red nose wired to the grill. When I showed them the boxes, there were hugs all around. It was the happiest I'd felt in months. When Sue, Russ, and David left, I was exhausted and relieved. It had been a head-spinning few weeks. I hadn't fully grasped how much of a risk I was taking. If anybody in my family found out I was doing, there would be repercussions. I knew how vindictive they were. But there was no way to gauge how serious the consequences might be. Anything would pale in comparison to what they'd already done. I finally felt as though I might be able to make a difference after all. In the past, there had been nothing I could do that would be significant enough, so I hadn't tried very hard, because being good or doing good didn't count for much. Whatever you did had to be extraordinary. You couldn't just be a prosecutor. You had to be the best prosecutor in the country. You had to be the federal judge. You couldn't just fly planes. You had to be a professional pilot for a major carrier at the dawn of the jet age. For a long time, I blamed my grandfather for my feeling this way, but none of us realized that the expectation of being the best, in my grandfather's view, had applied only to my father, who had failed, and Donald, who had wildly exceeded Fred's expectations. When I finally realized that my grandfather didn't care what I accomplished or contributed, and that my own unrealistic expectations were paralyzing me, I still felt that only a grand gesture would set it right. It wasn't enough for me to volunteer at an organization helping Syrian refugees. I had to take Donald down. After the election, Donald called his big sister, ostensibly to find out how he was doing. Of course, he thought he already knew the answer. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made the call in the first place. He merely wanted her to confirm very strongly that he was doing a fantastic job. When she said, "Not that good," Donald immediately went on offense. "That's nasty," he said. She could see the sneer on his face. Then, seemingly apropos of nothing, he asked her, "Maryanne, where would you be without me?" It was a smug reference to the fact that Maryanne owed her first federal judgeship to Donald because Roy Coyne had done him and her a favor all those years ago. My aunt has always insisted that she's earned her position on the bench entirely on her own merits, and she shot back at him, "If you say that one more time, I will level you." But it was an empty threat. Although Maryanne had prided herself on being the only person on the planet Donald ever listened to, those days were long past, which was illustrated not long after in June 2018. On the eve of Donald's first summit with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, Maryanne called the White House and left a message with his secretary. "Tell him," his older sister called, with a little sisterly advice. "Prepare. Learn from those who know what they are doing. Stay away from Dennis Rodman and leave his Twitter at home." He ignored all of it. The Politico headline the following day read, "Trump says Kim meeting will be about attitude, not prep work." If Maryanne had ever had any sway over her little brother, it was gone now. Aside from the requisite birthday call, they didn't speak after that. While they were working on the article, the Times reporter invited me to join them for the tour of my grandfather's properties on the morning of January 10th, 2018. They picked me up in David's SUV, still adorned with its antlers and red nose, at the Jamaica train station. We started at the Highlander, where I'd grown up, and over the course of the day, we traversed snowdrifts and patches of ice in an effort to visit as much of the Trump empire as possible. After 9 hours, we still hadn't managed to see all of it. I had traded in my crutches for a cane by then, but was still exhausted, mentally and physically, when I got home. I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I'd always known that my grandfather owned buildings, but I'd had no idea just how many. More disturbing, my father had apparently owned 20% of some of the buildings I'd never heard of before. On October 2nd, 2018, the New York Times published an almost 14,000-word article, the longest in its history, revealing the long litany of potentially fraudulent and criminal activities my grandfather's aunts and uncles had engaged in. Through the extraordinary reporting of the Times team, I learned more about my family's finances than I'd ever known. Donald's lawyer, Charles J. Harder, predictably denied the allegations, but the investigative reporters laid out a devastating case. Over the course of Fred's life, he and my grandmother had transferred hundreds of millions of dollars to their children. While my grandfather was alive, Donald alone had received the equivalent of $413 million, much of it through questionable means. Loans that he had never repaid, investments in properties that had never matured, essentially gifts that had never been taxed. That did not include the $170 million he had received through the sale of my grandfather's empire. The amounts of money the articles mentioned were mind-boggling, and the four siblings had benefited for decades. Dad had clearly shared in the wealth early in his life, but he had had nothing left to show for it by the time he was 30. I have no idea what happened to his money. In 1992, only 2 years after Donald's attempt to attach the codicil to my grandfather's will, effectively cutting his siblings out, the four of them suddenly needed one another. After a lifetime of my father playing them off against one another, after a lifetime of their fathers playing them off against one another, they finally had a common purpose: to protect their inheritance from the government. Fred had refused to heed his lawyer's advice to cede control of his empire to his children before his death in order to minimize estate taxes. That meant that Maryanne, Elizabeth, Donald, and Robert would be responsible for potentially hundreds of millions of dollars of estate taxes. In addition to dozens of buildings, my grandfather had amassed extraordinary sums of cash. His properties carried no debt and brought in millions of dollars every year. The sibling solution was to establish all-country building supply and maintenance. At that point, my grandfather was effectively sidelined by his increasing dementia, not that he would have objected to their scheme, and since my father was long gone, Maryanne, Donald, and Robert could do whatever they wanted. They were our trustees, but there was no one to force them to fulfill their obligation to Fritz and me, and they could easily keep us out of the loop. My aunts and uncles detested paying taxes almost as much as their father did, and it seemed the main purpose of all country was to siphon money from Trump management through large gifts disguised as legitimate business transactions, according to the article. The ruse was so effective that when Fred died in 1999, he had only $1.9 million in cash and no assets larger than a $10.3 million IOU from Donald. After Gam's death the following year, the combined value of my grandfather's estate was said to be just $51.8 million, a laughable assertion, especially since the siblings sold the empire for more than $700 million 4 years later. My grandfather's investment in Donald had been extremely successful in the short term. He had strategically deployed millions of dollars and often tens of millions of dollars at key moments in Donald's career. Sometimes the funds had supported the image and the lifestyle that came with it. Sometimes they had bought Donald access and favors. With increasing frequency, they had bailed him out. In that way, Fred purchased the ability to bask in Donald's reflected glory, satisfied with the knowledge that none of it would have been possible without his expertise and largesse. In the long run, however, my grandfather, who had one wish, that his empire survive in perpetuity, lost everything. Whenever my brother and I met with Robert to discuss my grandfather's estate, he was emphatic about honoring my grandfather's wish that we get nothing. When it came to their own benefit, however, the four surviving Trump siblings had no compunction about doing the one thing my grandfather least would have wanted. When Donald announced his desire to sell, nobody put up a fight. In 2004, the vast majority of the empire my grandfather had spent more than 7 decades building was sold to a single buyer, Ruby Schron, for $705.6 million. The bank's financing the sale for Schron had assigned a value of almost $1 billion to the properties. So in one fell swoop, my Uncle Donald, the master deal maker, left almost $300 million on the table. Selling the estate in bulk was a strategic disaster. The smartest thing would have been to keep Trump management intact. With practically no effort on their part, the four siblings could have earned $5 million to $10 million a year each. But Donald needed a much bigger infusion of cash. Such a paltry sum, even if it came to him annually, wasn't going to cut it. They could also have sold the buildings and complexes individually. That would have added substantially to the selling price. That process, though, would have been a lengthy one. Donald, whose Atlantic City creditors were nipping at his heels, didn't want to wait. Besides, it would have been almost impossible to keep the news of dozens of sales a secret. They needed to complete the sale in one transaction as quickly and as quietly as possible. They succeeded on that score. It may be the one and only of Donald's real estate deals that received no press attention. Whatever objection Maryanne, Elizabeth, and Robert might have had, they kept to themselves. Even now, Maryanne, almost 10 years older, smarter, and more accomplished than the second youngest Trump child, deferred to him. Donald always got his way, she said. Besides, none of them could risk waiting. They all knew where the bodies were buried because they had buried them together in all country. Split 4 ways, they got approximately $170 million each. For Donald, it was still not enough. Maybe it wasn't for any of them. Nothing ever was. When I visited Maryanne in September 2018, less than a month before the article was published, she mentioned that she had been contacted by David Barstow, my cousin David, who had tracked my grandfather's old accountant, Jack Micknick, now 91, to a nursing home somewhere in Florida, believed he must have been the source of the expose. Maryanne brushed the whole thing off and suggested that the article was merely about the 1990 codicil controversy. Ugh. If she did speak to Barstow, though, she must have known the extent of what they were looking into. All country, the potential tax fraud. But she seemed unfazed by it. I wondered, now for completely different reasons, why she and Robert hadn't tried everything in their power to dissuade Donald from running for president. They couldn't possibly have thought that he, and by extension they, would continue to escape scrutiny. I met with Maryanne again shortly before the article ran. She denied all of it. She was just a girl, after all. When a piece of paper requiring her signature had been put in front of her, she'd signed it. No questions asked. This article goes back 60 years. You know that's before I was a judge, she said, as if the investigation had also ended 60 years before. She seemed unconcerned that there would be any repercussions. Although a court inquiry had been opened into her alleged conduct, all she had had to do to put an end to it was retire, which she did, thereby retaining her $200,000 a year pension. Oh my God. Oh, I hate people so much. In the interim, she had transferred her suspicion from the geriatric Jack Micknick to her first cousin, John Walter, my grandfather's sister, Elizabeth's son, who had died that January. I marveled at the ease with which Maryanne jumped to that conclusion. John had worked for and with my grandfather for decades, had benefited enormously from his uncle's wealth, and had been heavily involved in all country, and, as far as I knew, had always been very loyal. I thought it was strange she would implicate him, although her suspicion of him worked in my favor. What I didn't know at the time was that John's obituary had neglected to mention Donald. John had always been interested in Trump family history and boastful of his connection with Trump management, so that was a remarkable omission. More surprisingly, though, was the fact that Maryanne didn't seem to think that I would find anything in the article disturbing, as if she, too, had come to believe a version of events that obliterated the truth and rewrote history. It didn't occur to her that the revelations would affect me in any way. In fact, the vast amounts of money the siblings had possibly stolen made their fight with me over my grandfather's will and their drastic devaluation of our partnership share, which I now understood for the first time, seemed pathologically petty, and their treatment of my nephew vis-a-vis our medical insurance even more cruel. All right, folks. That's it. Hang on to your hats because we are in for the final couple of chapters here. I've got chapter 14 and then right into the epilogue. So we've only got a couple more days together. I know. It's sad, isn't it? If you have any book recommendations for another one of these, I don't know, let's call them goodnight stories, right? Read sessions. Then let me know. Throw it in the comments. I may take a little bit of a break. Who knows? Maybe we can read a memoir of somebody who isn't connected to the Trump family. I don't know. You tell me. In any event, stay sane. dear God, keep that TV off tonight. And if you do watch something, make it something totally bonkers, because God help me if I hear that man's voice. All right. Love you all. Stay safe.